On today's World Insight, Bongbong Marcos is the presumptive president after winning the Philippine election by a large margin. What does a Marcos presidency mean for the Philippines and the world? Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello, this is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has emerged the front runner by a huge margin in May the 9th presidential elections in the Philippines. Chinese President Xi Jinping on Wednesday congratulated him on his victory. A former senator and the son of the late President Ferdinand Marcos, he promised more jobs, lower food prices, and more investments in agriculture and infrastructure. Now, with the new president taking power in June, there could be a reset for the Philippines' relationship with China and the U.S., some say, and its outcome could be consequential to the Asia-Pacific region. For deeper insights, let's loop in our panelists from the region. For more on the latest about the Filipino election, we are joined in Manila, Romel Benlawi, who is the president of the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies. Good to see you. In Tokyo, Lin Tenwai, adjunct senior research fellow from East Asian Institute at National University of Singapore. In Beijing, last but not least, Rong Ying, vice president of China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. So, a brand new election with a very different team. Now, Mr. Benlawi, your take as a Filipino about the latest result?
Well, as a result of the May 9, 2022 elections, we are now writing our history that we have the most number of votes given to the president since our election started in 1907. President-elect Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos got the majority vote of the Filipino people of 31 million, and that is a landmark in Philippine electoral history. The vice president right now is the daughter of President Duterte. So we see the combination of two major political finalists in the Philippines running the Republic of the Philippines right now.
Many are not necessarily surprised by the result. Now, what about this team? What is likely to be the messages it is sending to both the Filipinos and also the rest of the region and the world?
Well, that our democracy is operating in the Philippines and we have a stable political system. And the will of the Filipino people has spoken, and they have elected another Marcos in the government, because Ferdinand Marcos Junior is the son of the late President Ferdinand Marcos Senior.
We saw mixed response, it seems, reactions coming from the region and also from the West. The latter rather skeptical, yet the rest of the region are applauding with calm. So how do you read these mixed signals coming from different sides?
Well, because of different expectations from the region. But right now, President-elect Bongbong Marcos will try to pursue a foreign policy that will welcome all friends. You know, he will pursue an inclusive foreign policy, and that is to welcome all friends, pursuing friendly relationship with China and pursuing friendly relationship with the United States and all other countries in the world.
Now, Mr. Lim, tell me more about your thoughts coming from Southeast Asia about the latest results.
I think ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries are very enthusiastic to work with the Philippines because before the pandemic, the Philippines was one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It also has a good, strong IT capabilities. which Singapore, for example, which started the network of smart cities, would be very much interested to engage with Manila and other IT hubs in ASEAN in order to catch up with the Industry 4.0 revolution. And there's also a lot of excitement about the post-pandemic situation in the ASEAN because, as you know, ASEAN in December 2015 quietly formed the ASEAN Economic Community. Right. And it is expected that after the pandemic, there can be a stronger impulse to get ASEAN to get ASEAN closer together to form a common market and to reach out to other major powers in the region for trade and for economic relations.
A lot of expectations. All of this might be falling on the clock of this new administration, yet to be announced by the final result at the end of the month. Let me go to you, Mr. Rong, as well. We see the Chinese president already congratulated the president-elect and his team, and how has been talking about China and the Philippines have been going through together as a thick and thin. Now, there are a lot actually messages within this sentence alone. But tell me more about overall, how is China looking at the result of the election?
Well, certainly, I think China was very much happy to see that the elections has been taking place in such a smooth and way. And I think there are expectations that the relationship that has been opened up by President Duterte in 2016 would be continued. Not only because of his daughter is now the vice president, but also I think the past 6 years have seen that the relationship has been moving, has been sort of from out of the difficulties, out of the problems that has been have had during the previous administration under the Aquino III. More importantly, I think China sees the Philippines as a major and rising sort of regional economies that will provide, open up big opportunities for both for China and Philippines to achieve sort of cooperation based on mutual respect and mutual benefit.
The earlier administration, the Duterte administration, has been focusing, at least in the agenda, on infrastructure building, the so-called Build project. Now, we understand that the Marcos administration, the father, was also putting a lot of emphasis on infrastructure. Of course, that was during the 1980s, very different story then. But Mr. Balawi, how do you see the new team in the office likely to continue both that legacy and also the earlier ambition?
Well, as indicated during the campaign, President-elect Bongbong Marcos will definitely continue the effort of President Duterte to promote infrastructure development in the Philippines. So under President Duterte, they call it build. And President Duterte will continue that effort, but maybe President-elect Marcos will use a different term for that, but definitely he will promote infrastructure development enshrined in the Build program. Well, of course, he will continue the infrastructure programs in Mindanao, because that is also one of the strategies of the Philippine government under the Bongbong administration to improve the infrastructure in Mindanao so that it can create and promote economic development, which is very essential in addressing ongoing internal armed conflicts in the area. Because if there will be economic development, then there will be less chances for the people to take their arms against the government. But of course, because President-elect Bongbong Marcos is coming from the northern part of the Philippines, he will also improve the infrastructure in the northern part of the Philippines, especially in the creation of new airports and new seaports. And because the mother, Imelda, comes from Visayas in central Philippines, so he will also promote the infrastructure development there in terms of building more bridges, because Visayas is a scattered island, so he will continue the efforts of President Duterte to build bridges. And I think China will play a vital role in this infrastructure development.
In what way, though, do you think?
Especially in the financing of this infrastructure development. There's a strong likelihood for President-elect Bongbong Marcos to continuously engage China in order to finance the infrastructure development, especially accessing the funds available from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank being led by China, and also to take advantage in the implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative in Asia. And President-elect Bongbong Marcos would like to take part actively in the implementation of China's Belt and Road Initiative in Asia, so that the Philippines will also benefit from the projects arising from the BRI efforts.
Yes, as we earlier mentioned, the Philippines before the pandemic was one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Now, Mr. Rong, China certainly take note of that. There has been a lot of interactions, including infrastructure. Now, among all the projects that China and the Philippines have been having, where do you think are likely to be the priorities with this new administration, with President-elect Bongbong Marcos?
Well, certainly, I think the infrastructure part, it would be one of the priority areas, as we agreed that this is also, I think, the areas where China is very much strong, not only in terms of financing, but also, I think, in terms of expertise, and also the Chinese companies, they have a very good record. I mean, either being taking the contract, or working together with the local companies to implement these projects with high quality. This is certainly a very important area. Other issues, I think, if you look at the past 6 years of practical cooperation, will be agriculture and other areas where can produce jobs, good jobs, and on and so forth. Last but not least, for me, I think the digital economy, it can be also an area of great importance for China and Philippines.
Also, for the ASEAN economies, Mr. Lim, how do you see the Philippines are likely to make its way in terms of how ASEAN might be playing a pivotal role in maintaining the peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific region, and also in promoting trade in the region?
Well, the Philippines is a very important member of ASEAN. It was one of the founding members. And also the Philippines is probably a pivotal economy in the maritime Southeast Asia. And also a large number of its population speak English as a working language. So in this sense, Philippines is very much potentially poised for globalization. And it also has a large expatriate working community overseas. So it has existing large networks of overseas Filipinos that it can tap into for economic development and regionalism. So these are the strengths that the Philippines have. And in some industries, the Philippines actually dominate the industry. For example, ship navigators, the profession of nursing, and many other high-skilled professions in which Filipino skills are very much appreciated. And so all these skills can be tapped into for the ASEAN economic community. And also in the future, as ASEAN releases stops or decreases the barriers to human flows, human capital exchanges, certainly the Philippines will be in the center of it.
So, Mr. Baloy, as you can see, a lot of expectations for the Philippines for years to come with the President-elect Bongbong Marcos. But tell me more about how do you see the Philippines standing in the place where both China and the United States, the world's two largest economies, are trying to get close to, and also trying to make sure it will be partnered with?
We have to understand that under President-elect Bongbong Marcos, he will pursue the policy of promoting Asian regionalism. And it is in this context that President Duterte will promote friendly relationship with China because China is an important Asian power. So it is in that context that he will really promote friendship with China because of Asian regionalism. Second is his priority to promote development diplomacy. And for development diplomacy, he regards China as an important provider of economic needs of the Philippines towards economic development. But at the same time, the Philippines also has security needs. And the United States is a security provider of the Philippines. And that is why President-elect Marcos will continue to uphold the importance of our security alliance with the United States, but in a different context. President-elect Bongbong Marcos does not want to make this alliance as an opportunity for the United States to control the Philippines. President-elect Marcos does not want to be controlled by the United States, and he will pursue a more autonomous policy towards that. He values the alliance, but without necessarily being controlled by the United States. And he will also value friendship with China, but will not allow this friendship with China to be used for policy of subservience. So under President-elect Marcos, he will pursue what we call inclusive foreign policy, and that is pursuing friendly relationship with China, and at the same time maintaining security alliance with the United States and promoting Asian regionalism by cultivating closer ties with Asian neighbors, particularly the members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which will be the cornerstone of Philippine regional policy.
This is going to be a very important and yet very challenging tightrope walking. As we know, the world's changes have not settled down yet. So a lot of, react and decide along the way. Now, Mr. Ban Loy, how much confidence do you have about the President-elect Bongbong Marcos, about his experience, his upbringing, his political philosophy, shall I say, or political thoughts that would make sure he can do this job, this tightrope walking, this balancing well?
He was already exposed in the area of foreign policy when his mother, Imelda Marcos, was doing a lot of travels to promote back-channeling the diplomacy. She was carrying with her Bongbong Marcos. Bongbong Marcos was there in 1975 when Imelda Marcos met Mao Zedong. So in order to establish the relationship, Bongbong Marcos also met Zhou Enlai and many other Chinese leaders, including Deng Xiaoping. So he had the fond memories of his trips to China, and he was exposed to the job of his father as president. And this is not his first time to be in Malacanang. This is a homecoming for him. And he was exposed to the foreign policy of the father, especially the influence of the mother, who became one of the very important conduits of former President Marcos in diplomacy. So he's really well versed. And as a leader, he became governor and he was a senator, So he had enough experience in running the government, in pursuing foreign relations.
Mr. Rong, you can see the description coming from Mr. Ban Loy, believing that the president-elect is well prepared for the challenges in terms of any country right now to have the tightrope walking, shall we put it that way. Now, he is certainly very cosmopolitan. He was brought up in big cities. He had experiences together with his family, exposures to leadership elsewhere, including with senior leaders of China. Also, he moved to the United States together with a family in Hawaii later, and certainly have exposures to the United States as well. So how do you see, Mr. Rong, the task of this president-elect when trying to balance the right position of the Philippines for the best interest of the Philippines between China and the United States?
Yeah, I think the most important thing for leadership, for a leader like that, given his certainly the President-elect Marcos, his rich experiences, is of course to safeguard, to defend its own sort of interest. I agree that in this world, the fast-changing world, it would not be easy. But I think as far as China is concerned, China would respect a country like Philippines, the Philippines to conduct its foreign policy in an independent way by taking into account its own interests, not the instructions of any other countries. While in the meantime, I think China understands that the Philippines has a strong relationship, security relationship with the United States. After all, it's they are allies. And I guess China only hope that that bilateral relationship, bilateral alliance would not sort of undermine China's interest. And in the meantime, I think China would also work with Philippines, the new president, in a bilateral and also regional context. So big expectations. Certainly, I think knowing each other, a long history, as I think President Xi's congratulatory messages said, and also the gestures from the Chinese side that's extended to the new president.
Just to follow up about the territorial disputes, of course, that was once a huge issue. Later, it faded out to a certain extent. How do you see discussions like this, and how do you see both sides should lay the groundwork for a smooth transition, for a more peaceful interaction between the two countries? Mr. Rong, very briefly.
Yeah, I think both China and the Philippines know very well that we have different views on the question of the territorial disputes. But the past experiences, that has told us that it has to be put in the right context so that it would not hijack or affect the overall relationship. And in the meantime, I think as we have seen, that joint efforts have been made to explore possible areas of joint explorations while sort of upholding their own respective positions on that. And in the meantime, they work together with ASEAN as a whole to pursue, to continuously the negotiations of the so-called COC, the Code of Conduct, so that to make sure the region as a whole would become a region, a sea of cooperation, friendship, that would, instead of issues that are dividing or even undermine the prosperity, security, and stability that the region has enjoyed.
I need to have Mr. Ban Loi to also respond to that.
President-elect Marcos will be willing to discuss Philippine differences with China bilaterally. He is open to the idea of continuing negotiations and direct consultations, learn lessons from the gains of President Duterte in bilaterally dealing with China, especially in the context of the bilateral consultative mechanism in the South China Sea, where they discuss a lot of issues of cooperation. And I think President-elect Marcos is willing to discuss areas of pragmatic cooperation in the South China Sea, especially in joint fishery management, marine environmental protection, and most importantly, joint development of natural gas and oil. President-elect Bongbong Marcos is open to discuss these things with China, and he is interested to promote pragmatic cooperation with China.
We have seen very interesting phenomenon. Well, the result of the Filipino election to be revealed by the end of the month. Mr. Lim, tell me more about your thoughts of how the ASEAN countries are trying to walk independently in terms of foreign policy, but at the same time try to consult different sides while these changes are still taking place.
ASEAN, as you know, focuses on the idea of ASEAN centrality. And ASEAN centrality means that the ASEAN is a hub with spokes that is connected to all major powers in the region, whether it's the US or China or other middle powers or other powers as well. So in this sense, the ASEAN centrality will mean that ASEAN is willing to engage with all powers in terms of economic cooperation, as well as dialogue, as well as other forms of cooperation in, for example, fighting the pandemic without isolating, any major powers from the process. So in this sense, President Biden, who is going to have the meeting with ASEAN countries, is probably a reflection of his promise for multilateralism during his campaign. And at the same time, ASEAN is also looking forward to working with China and also with other major powers in the region. And certainly the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, has been China's signature economic diplomacy in the region. And ASEAN countries probably will continue to engage with China on that. And throughout the pandemic, you can see very clearly that ASEAN-China cooperation has not stopped. It has not decreased. There have been, exchanges of materials, vaccines, know-how and knowledge between the two regions.
Certainly.
There was also constant digital communications between them. So this is likely to continue.
And of course, not to mention RCEP. Just to add it to that, we have noticed that the Prime Minister of Singapore, during his various trips to the United States recently, has not been using the phrase so-called the Indo-Pacific, but been talking about the region as Asia-Pacific. Well, of course, that's just a words of phrase, yet it's certainly trying to, in a way, reflects how Singapore and other ASEAN countries are trying to walk independently for the centrality.
Well, during campaign and presidential debates, President-elect Bongbong Marcos emphasized the importance of ASEAN centrality in managing regional security affairs, but he emphasized one important element in order to attain ASEAN centrality, and that is to accomplish ASEAN unity, because ASEAN cannot play a central role in Asia-Pacific security without ASEAN unity. So President-elect Bongbong Marcos will promote in its foreign policy the unity of ASEAN so that it can play a central role in regional security affairs.
I see. Well, on that note, we are wrapping up today's conversation. Thank you so much for the three of you joining us. Romel Baloy and Lin Tianwei, last but not least, Rong Ying. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. And that's the discussion. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for being with me. Bye for now.